plans. So I want to start off today by thinking about a distinction which Michael Bratman draws in his work on collective action. It's a distinction between, on the one hand, shared cooperative activity, and on the other hand, what Bratman calls prepackaged cooperation. So in his 1992 paper, Michael Bratman is interested in analysing the structures of intention and action which are involved in what he calls shared cooperative activity. And he characterises these structures by arguing that there are a kind of network of individual intentions that make up a collective or shared intention, and that shared intention then goes on to guide a pattern of individual activities which are mutually responsive. Now, when he characterises the pattern of intention, he makes the point that it's possible to have a shared intention but not to have what he thinks of as like shared cooperative activity if people form a plan to do something together and then that plan specifies that they go off and do things separately, not working together. And he says that in this case, when there's a shared intention but the plan separates people up, then what we have got isn't shared cooperative activity. This is a case of prepackaged cooperation. And to my knowledge, nowhere does he analyse the kind of structures of agency involved in that kind of category. Now, one thing that I think happens when Bratman makes his move is he buys into the idea that as soon as there's a division of labour in collective action, then we've moved out of this category of shared cooperative activity and into some other category to pay attention to. Okay. Now, this isn't to say that Bratman thinks that action characterised by division of labour isn't a kind of collective action or isn't a kind of collective action that matters, but rather that he just doesn't analyse it, right? So his methodology isn't to give like sets of necessary conditions for collective action. He's interested in giving like a set of sufficient conditions. He talks about creature construction and this project of demonstrating the explanatory potential of his planning theory from the individual case. Now, so this isn't like a straight counterexample. I think what's going on here is that there's an important feature of collective action, the division of labour, and by shunting that feature into a set of collective actions he's not going to pay attention to, Bratman's not successfully giving an account of those kinds of structures. Okay, so just to quickly say, so I think it's plausible if you look outside of philosophy to think that the division of labour, rather than being some kind of peripheral feature or feature of non-central cases, really is a central feature of collective action. And I think we see this particularly clearly if we look at sociological literature on the nature of work under capitalism. And one feature of a lot of that literature is that work under capitalism is largely organised around not just the division of labour, but a particularly extreme form of the division of labour. So we can see this in literature on gig work, think about Deliveroo and Uber, literature on platform work, like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and also work on call centres. So what I want to try and do in this paper is to treat work as a test case for theories of collective action. So I want to look at the cases where the division of labour is most pronounced and think about how we can try and make sense of those cases. And I'm going to argue that actually Bratman's planning theory from the individual case is going to be a lot better off than we might have thought. Okay, so here's the goal, the claims I'm going to argue for. So I'm going to argue that Bratman's distinction between shared cooperative activity and pre-packaged cooperation is at best like misstated. It's kind of not, the distinction isn't the right thing to make here. What we've really got is a set of a spectrum of cases, and the spectrum involves different levels of granularity of partial plans. I'll say more about that in a second. So this means that I'm not kind of taking issue with the planning theory. Actually, the planning theory has some useful resources to think about these cases in this distinction. And secondly, I'm going to try and argue that the division of labour is not a barrier to thinking about work as a kind of collective action. So that's going to be true of work. It's also going to be true of other cases in which there is a division of labour, but the collective action isn't organised around buying people's labour. So non-work examples of division of labour. Now, this isn't to say that I'm going to argue that the work is a kind of collective action, but rather to take away one barrier for thinking that. Okay, so two kinds of background projects in the offing here. So one is to think about the diversity of collective actions and thinking about the resources we need to understand that diversity. And the second project in the background is to think about how we should be thinking about work under capitalism. So there's one kind of tradition which we might think of as like an instrumentalist tradition that we could take out of some remarks of Marx, where Marx says that workers are treated as instruments. And that might make us think that there isn't really a collective action in work under capitalism, it's just workers being treated as instruments by management or by the machines they're working alongside. And on the other hand, there's a view of work under capitalism we might call collectivist, where there are genuine forms of collective action involved in work under capitalism, it's just that they are unrecognised and undervalued. Okay, good. So just say a bit about the plan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about partial plans first to get that set of machinery front of mind. I'm going to talk a little bit about work, pulling on the work of Harry Braverman, and then I'm going to put things together and think about how we can think about work as a kind of collective action involving a particular kind of partial plan. Okay, first part. So thinking about partial plans, and particularly the relation between partial plans, knowledge, and questions. Okay, so in Intentions, Plans, and Practical Reason, Michael Bratman gives an extended case for thinking that we should think about intentions as what he calls partial plans. So partial plans are partial in the sense that they only partially set out a plan for doing something, not a complete plan. They set out some details in advance. And he argues that the partial plans are useful for cognitively limited agents for two reasons. The first is that they help us stop deliberation, stop thinking about what to do, and think about how to do it. And they also are useful because they help us to spread out our deliberative activities across our kind of planning across time. If we set out a plan that says, like, here's the structure of what I'm going to do, I can then think about how to fit in better to that structure as I'm going along. Okay. Now, one remark from Bratman that I think is really helpful is this kind of offhand remark where he says that, of course, means ends coherence, which is the norm that he thinks governs partial plans, does not require that my plans specify what I'm to do down to the last detail. Rather, my plans will be at a level of abstraction appropriate to my habits and skills. So two ideas here. One is that partial plans can come at different levels of abstraction, and the other is that they connect to the knowledge we have. Okay, let's say a bit about each of those ideas in turn. So first about level of abstraction, I'm going to think about this about the granularity of a partial plan. So we can think about deliberation, like considering reasons, what to do, as answering this question, like what to do, and then a partial plan as answering or responding to the question which is raised by an answer to the question of what to do, which is the question of how to do it. Now, I think it's kind of natural to think about the level of abstraction of a partial plan as corresponding to how complete an answer to the question of how to do something is. So two kinds of poles on a spectrum here. So on the one hand, we might have very coarse-grained plans, which answer some general sub-questions of the question of how to do something, but leave lots to be resolved kind of along the way. And on the other hand, like a fine-grained plan, which answers lots of specific sub-questions with only a few sub-questions to be answered. So two ways of thinking about this, kind of how big are your answers in response to the question and how many or how big are the sub-questions that you've answered. Okay, so that's a bit abstract. Here's a kind of way of thinking about this. I think it's helpful to think about recipes when we're thinking about partial plans and their granularity. So on the one hand, we have very coarse-grained recipes, and you might find those in books for like experienced chefs. Here's a book, a recipe for mayonnaise in the Edinburgh Book of Plain Cookery, which gives like just 4 steps. It's really basic. The cook has to make a lot of decisions and fill out a lot of steps as they go along. This is a bit more of an aide-memoire than a full like how-to. But on the other hand, if we think about recipes which are written for beginner cooks or for cooks that are learning like a new cuisine, there'll be tons of details in the recipe, right? So they'll really give like fine-grained answers to a bunch of different questions about how to perform different steps, what to do if things go wrong. So this is an example from Samin Nosrat's book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. So the recipe for mayonnaise, tons more detail, loads more steps, whole way of resolving things if things go wrong. Okay, so that gets us to think about granularity. Second thing to think about the relation between partial plans and knowledge. Now I want to think about this through an idea that I've argued for in other work, which is that there is a knowledge how norm on intention. And that norm says that you must intend to do something only if you know how to do it. Now this places two kinds of restrictions on intentions. on the first hand, it kind of places restrictions on what you intend. So you better not intend to do things that you don't know how to do. I shouldn't intend to dance a tango in an hour's time if I don't know how to dance a tango. But on the other hand, it can also place a restriction on how you intend. If we think about kind of bigger plans or like longer term plans, there's a kind of way in which, if you don't have much knowledge, you can form a plan to do something, but only a very specific kind of plan. So if we think back to the distinction between the two kinds of recipes for mayonnaise, a beginner chef maybe oughtn't, by the knowledge hand of intention, to form an intention to just make mayonnaise, but they could form an intention to follow this very specific plan that they found in a recipe, even if they've kind of internalized that plan. Okay, so an idea here is that fine-graining a plan, forming a fine-grained partial plan, is a way to get around like relative ignorance. And that's because it helps you to answer simpler questions. You're answering smaller sub-questions of the how-to question, and often it will also simplify the task, right? So rather than like having you lots of choice points where different parts of the activity will relate to each other and you have to coordinate yourself across time, you'll just have like one simple recipe to follow. Okay, good. So that gives us a way of thinking about partial plans, their granularity, and how they connect to knowledge. I now want to move on to kind of a bit more of an empirical part of the paper, which is thinking about what work is like under the division of labour. So I want to take a particular kind of description of work under the extreme division of labour from the work of Harry Bratman in his book Labour and Monopoly Capital. So this is an interesting book. It's a kind of strange mixture of like bits of history, bits of like management theory and organisational theory, tied all together within a picture of like the Marxist theory of the labour process. And Bratman's key claim in this book is that work under capitalism is centrally organised, kind of animating principle is the division of labour, which is applied in order to get like maximum efficiency out of workers. And that, he thinks, produces a pattern of specific degraded work, which is morally problematic. Now, Bratman kind of gives three parts of this story about degraded work. He thinks that it involves prioritization solely of efficiency, a kind of fragmentation of tasks which are performed by workers, and this phenomenon of de-skilling, which is also connected to a kind of polarization of knowledge. Okay, I'm going to say a bit about each of those in turn. So first to talk about the prioritization of efficiency. There's two parts of this idea. So the first part is that the division of labour is just an inherently more effective way of performing actions. So we might think about Adam Smith's remarks about the benefits of the division of labour here. But on the other hand, there's also an idea important in Bratman's work that the division of labour is helpful because it allows management to control very specific details of the labour process, avoiding kind of workers from slacking off or doing things which benefit them but don't benefit people who are the owners of capital. Okay, so that's the first feature, the prioritization of efficiency above all else. The second feature is the fragmentation of tasks which is involved. So one feature of the division of labour is it doesn't just get applied once, but it can get applied repeatedly until the parts of a task which people are performing are extremely small, like monotonous, repetitive, and almost like meaningless to them. So this idea actually shows up really early in the kind of history of the division of labour. So the first wide-scale project, I think, in which Adam Smith's ideas about the division of labour were applied, was in the project of the French mathematician Gaspard de Prunay to produce a set of tables for logarithmic and trigonometric functions. And by applying the ideas of division of labour to calculation, de Prunay transformed this complicated intellectual task of calculation, which was hitherto performed by savants, like highly intelligent and trained people, into a task which could be performed by people who basically had very little mathematical education beyond like addition and subtraction. Right? So the task of like calculating a logarithmic result was transformed into very, very small parts. Okay, so and that's important because those people need to know a lot less than the savants do. Okay, and an interesting like kind of side point here is that this kind of fragmentation of tasks lays the groundwork for the mechanization of those tasks. So there's a kind of funny bit of history where Babbage's difference engine, which was his first mechanical computer, was directly inspired by de Prunay's use of human computers to solve logarithmic functions. So there's a kind of way in which like the human fragmentation of tasks lays the groundwork for mechanization. Okay, third feature of work under capitalism is this phenomenon of de-skilling. Okay, So there's two parts of here. There's one which is that people need to know less in order to perform a task overall, and the other is that the knowledge is moved around. Right, there's some of the same knowledge is had, but it's moved around. Okay, so let me just run through these points. So the first point is that by splitting tasks into smaller pieces, they can be performed by workers with less skill. So think about de Prony's human computers. They didn't need to be savants, they needed to know addition and subtraction. The second idea, which reduces the amount of knowledge required, is what Bratman calls the Babbage Principle. So Babbage notes that the division of labour allows you to kind of purchase exactly the labour you want, the bare amount of labour you need to perform a task. So it allows you to kind of skim off, or allows you to avoid the need for kind of surplus labour, which might be required. The surplus knowledge, which might be required very rarely to perform the whole task. There's also an important idea in the background, I think, here, that the fragmentation of a task often involves its simplification, right? So tasks become simpler as the division of labour is applied. So here we might think about the way in which clothing manufacture was changed through the 19th century, starting off as tailoring for specific people, and ending up as the manufacture of specific clothing sizes, like small, medium, large, right? You transform the task. It's no longer how to make clothes for this people, but how to make clothing for these different sizes. And one feature that Bratman also stresses here is that as a division of labour is applied, planning is taken away from the workers and put towards management, and that means that the knowledge required to do planning is taken away from workers and is reconstituted into knowledge that's usable by management. Okay, so we've got a picture of how work under capitalism works, right? The idea that involves prioritization of efficiency, the fragmentation of tasks, and this kind of de-skilling. So, question, can we still think about those kinds of features as involving different kinds of partial plans, or even those involving kinds of collective action? Are these things that the planning theory can help us with? Okay. So putting things together a bit. So I want to suggest that if we move to thinking about the collective case, this distinction I drew at the beginning between coarse and fine-grained partial plans is going to emerge just in the same way, right? So on the one hand, we'll have coarse-grained partial plans where people don't answer many questions about how they're going to collaborate together and how things are going to work out as they go along, and they kind of rely on the-fly cooperation, the unfolding development of plans, and their ability to do what Jonathan Birch calls kind of coordination-enabled activities that flag up parts of their actions relevant to other people. But on the other hand, we'll see that there's also fine-grained collective plans, right, which specify all the details in advance and also specify the mode of collaboration in advance and might have very little need for these kinds of mutuality and coordination between different people. So the suggestion I want to make is that Bratman's given us an account of coarse-grained partial plans, but there's also another kind of partial plan which we want to give an account of, which are these fine-grained partial plans. Okay, now I think it's these fine-grained partial plans that we're seeing in cases of work under capitalism. But that doesn't mean that there's a special thing that's evolving here. All we're seeing in work under capitalism is the extreme version of principles which we find even in the cases of individual activity, right? Fine-grained partial plans are things that we do ourselves as individuals when we follow very finely specified recipes. Actually, this is the point Braverman makes himself, right? So he talks about people performing the same task again and again and applying a division of labour to themselves. So all that I think we've got going on here is that individuals forming partial plans are engaging in a kind of diachronic division of labour, splitting up their planning labour across time, whereas collectives are forming fine-grained partial plans which split up planning and action labour across different people. They split it up interpersonally. Now, interestingly, all these features of degraded work or work under capitalism that Braverman highlights actually can be predicted by the idea that these kinds of plans are partial plans, right? So fine-grained tasks, the kind of tasks which are given to us by fine-grained partial plans, are going to be the same thing again and again, right? They're going to be repetitious, meaningless and monotonous. There are going to be smaller questions that are going to get assigned to individuals, so they're going to require less knowledge. And the coordination and planning questions which are involved in that task are going to get shifted across from workers to management. Kind of those questions about coordination don't get dealt with by workers in an open-ended way, they get dealt with by management in a top-down way. And there's also an important idea that we saw in the case of individual partial plans that fine-graining would also simplify the tasks which would be which are to be performed. Okay, good. So look, it turns out Bratman wants to make this distinction. It looks kind of dubious if we want to take the division of labour to be a central feature of collective action, but actually the planning theory has a lot of good resources to help us understand what's going on in cases of the extreme division of labour. So a couple of upshots from this. So the first is that the distinction between shared cooperative activity and prepackaged cooperation isn't a sharp one, right? There's a kind of gradable spectrum of cases of the division of and the granularity of partial plans, right? And it's important to say here that there's a basic continuity between the planning structures involved in all of these cases, right? It's not like there's like two very different things at different ends. We've not got a Sorority's case. What I'm trying to suggest is that there's the same thing, but happening in different ways. Second thing to flag up is that this distinction between prepackaged cooperation and shared cooperative activity doesn't look like it's going to be a legitimate basis for drawing a line around a set of like central cases of collective action, because we find the kinds of structures involved in prepackaged cooperation at the individual level in individual intentional action. Now, there might be other ways to draw a boundary around kind of central cases of collective action which exclude cases of work. So we might think about Shapiro's work highlighting Bratman's inability to deal with like authority structures, or to deal with cases where workers are alienated from the collective activity that's being performed. So I haven't argued that we should definitely take work to be a case of collective action, but I think I have removed like one barrier towards that claim, right? So there's a bit of like progress towards thinking that we could at least possibly take work under capitalism not to be a case of like highly instrumentalized agents acting as part of other people's plans, but rather as cases of collective actions which are unrecognized and underappreciated. Okay, thanks.